Here's something you may not know. When your mother suggested you jump off a bridge if your friends were doing it, she had scientific evidence to back her up. Don't believe me? Just ask Solomon Asch.
Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school.
In the early 1950s, as the Cold War was heating up and the Soviet Union was on the rise, researchers in America were obsessed with groupthink and propaganda. But Asch had a problem with how most people viewed these topics. He thought something was missing. People didn't just go along with the group blindly, he theorized. Something more was at work. A Polish-born psychologist who had emigrated to America as a child 30 years earlier, Asch believed that social forces are powerful. Despite the fact that a single individual might not hold the group's beliefs, it would sometimes be easier just to go along with the crowd so as to not be confrontational. Or perhaps they weren't entirely sure the group was actually wrong. It might know something they didn't. Despite the Cold War sensibility prevalent in the US at the time, Asch didn't take as a given that conformity, or what he called an arbitrary and slavish submission to group pressure, was man's natural state. He believed social forces sometimes made people strive for independence too. In 1951, Asch conceived of an experiment that sought to determine whether a small crowd can influence us. He gathered 50 male students at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania for what he called a vision test. He sat them down and asked them to stare at two pictures. One, a single vertical black line, and the other, a set of 3 black lines. Then he asked, which one of the 3, A, B, or C, is the same length as the one by itself? This was a stupid, simple task, and sitting alone in a room, the subjects nailed it virtually every time. But when researchers sat the men in small groups around a table and asked them one by one to match the equal lines, error rates skyrocketed. Again and again, participants consistently chose the same wrong answer. What was going on here? Spoiler alert, it was all an elaborate hoax. In reality, every time Asch gathered the men around the tables, there was only one experimental subject in the room. Everyone else was a hired actor instructed to sit there and one by one give the same incorrect answer again and again. Asch referred to them as the wrong and unanimous majority. At the end of the row, waiting to speak, was the single hapless test subject who had no idea he was the only one not in on the ruse, or that he was alone in actually trying to answer the question correctly. As he sat there, he must have thought, "Am I losing my mind?" At that moment, the subject had a choice: either say the obviously correct answer or go along with the crowd and not risk being out of step. There was no reward or punishment either way, no hazing for a wrong answer or a celebration for a correct one, just the subject stewing in confusion and wondering how the crowd could be so stupid. What would you do? Nearly 1/3 of the time, the poor subjects went along with the crowd. Asch called these yielding subjects. Remember, alone in a room, they'd answered correctly pretty much every time. The error rate in those cases was less than 1%. But in a room full of peers, all silently waiting for an answer, they sided with the crowd on average every 3rd time. Asch would later write that the experiment was about the public independence and lack of independence in the face of arbitrary group opposition. He'd later take the experiment to 3 separate colleges, And on interviews afterwards, Asch found that there was a lot going on in people's minds. One of the yielding subjects would say he thought, "Everybody here's crazy but me." Another subject, who remained independent, said he wondered if I had paranoid tendencies. "I felt a bit flushed, but I answered as I saw them. Perhaps if there were 100 people in there, I might have gone along." And it should be said that a few of the subjects may have been at least a bit traumatized by the experience. One told Asch, "I thought that maybe because I wore glasses there was some defect," while another thought, "Maybe something's the matter with me, either mentally or physically." Asch would try several variations, replicating the experiment with what he called a true partner, a second subject who was either a second research subject or an actor instructed to provide the correct answer no matter what the rest of the crowd said. Asch found that if participants had just one true partner in the room, conformity to the wrong answer, seemingly agreed upon by the majority of others at the table, dropped sharply, just to 5%. Other researchers replicated Asch's study and found that even with the partner who seemed to have significant visual impairments, compliance dropped precipitously. In another variation that showed the power of peer pressure, subjects were allowed to write their answers down rather than having to say them in front of the crowd. As you might guess, they felt a lot more comfortable volunteering the correct answer if they didn't think anyone else would see it. Asch also played around with group sizes, finding that indeed size matters to an extent. With just one person in the room, conformity was low, just 3%. With 2 people, it rose to 13%. It topped out at 32%. With 3 people. Sound familiar? So why is this experiment important? Asch showed that conformity is real, that given the right circumstances, subjects would literally believe the crowd over the evidence of their own eyes. Distinct from pure behaviorists who were solely concerned with people's actions, Asch focused on how context shapes those actions in the first place. His research showed how being in the same room with just one ally bolsters a subject's belief about their knowledge and reduces their compliant behavior. But there are a few important caveats. Conformity wasn't universal by any means. Remember, only 32% of responses tracked with the wrong and unanimous majority, and for different reasons. Subsequent research has suggested the participants in these trials find it extremely stressful to disagree with the crowd, even though no one is criticizing them. 75% of true participants conformed to the incorrect majority at least once. On average, there was a 32% rate of conformity. Other researchers have suggested that the original group in 1951 may have been particularly compliant. When researchers replicated Asch's experiment in 1980, using engineering, math, and chemistry students as subjects, they found that in just one of 396 trials did an observer join the erroneous majority. And let's be real, choosing 2 lines whose lengths match is a kind of meaningless task. If real-life compliance is what we're measuring, then this is a funny way to do it. Also, let's talk about the subjects. 50 Swarthmore men are hardly a representative sample of the American population, even back in 1951. Not a single woman took part in the research. This was basically a locker room situation that Asch was asking us to believe is indicative of society at large. Then there's the question of what really went down in the lab. A few researchers have pointed out that Asch's experiment relies heavily on Confederates acting naturally, but that, well, most people coming in off the street aren't very good actors. The research subjects may suspect the group is in cahoots. This actually suggests that if someone could figure out a really good way to pull off this con job, compliance would go through the roof. Let's not dwell on that for too long. In 2010, a Japanese researcher actually came up with a way to put the Asch-holes out of business. He gathered up about 100 undergraduates and fitted them with special glasses that actually revealed different versions of the same picture, depending on which variation of glasses a person got. The results showed that female students who saw a different picture than the group conformed to their answers, but male students, not so much. Actually, even when the majority wasn't unanimous, nearly the same percentage of subjects wearing the other kind of glasses went along with the group. What Asch was onto was evidence of how our culture or our social groups may have more of a role in dictating our behavior despite the internal knowledge of each individual. Specifically, that behavior may be driven more by the desire for social acceptance than by our internal beliefs. In the end, the greatest legacy of Asch's experiment may be that it showed how easy it is to use peer pressure to manipulate people, giving rise to modern phenomena as diverse as vaccine denialism and fake news. Asch would go on to supervise the PhD work of Stanley Milgram, who, inspired by Asch's results, a decade later would develop a series of infamous experiments on obedience and authority figures. Asch died in 1996, but researchers have devised countless versions of his study in the past 69 years. As recently as September 2020, another Japanese researcher working with junior high school students found that those with lower grades tend to conform more frequently than those with higher grades, especially when the Asch-holes, the actors who seemingly can't grasp basic measurement, have higher grades. I guess our moms were right when they said we'd follow our friends off a bridge. Escaped the Ivory Tower is written, edited, and produced by us, Lindsay Portnoy and Greg Topo. For more information on our sources, our music, and our media, see the link below. And if you like what you heard, don't forget to tell your friends about us.